Grounded 2 has had a mixed start, but the Toxic Tangle update is one of the biggest yet. New areas, updates to existing systems, and plenty of new creatures. But does this update actually breathe new life into the game? Or is it just more of the same? When Grounded 2 first launched, I was fairly critical of it. The biggest issue for me was that the park felt a little safe. Visually, it was still impressive, but the environments didn't quite push things forward in a way that I was hoping for. Because of that, I ended up drifting away from the game after the Hairy Scary update. That update added a tarantula boss and a small expansion to the park, but it wasn't quite enough to pull me back in long term. Over the festive period, I actually skipped returning to the park entirely, which meant I also missed out on some of the seasonal content that came through. But with the release of the Toxic Tangle, I decided to jump back in and see what had changed. And after spending some time with it, I can say this update feels different. The park is starting to click a lot more with me, and I'm beginning to see the broader vision of what the developers seem to have for this world. There are some meaningful changes here, not just in terms of new content, but also mechanical updates that affect how the game plays. So the real question is this update enough to bring players back to Brookhollow Park? Let's take a look. The Toxic Tangle brings quite a few additions to Grounded 2, and the headline feature is the entirely new section to Brookhollow Park. This new area expands the park further and introduces several key gameplay systems alongside it. One of the most notable additions is the garden, which includes new labs as Onmont continue expanding its presence in the park. These labs act as new points of exploration and progression, encouraging players to push deeper into the environment. Alongside the new area comes an upgrade to the familiar research tools. The PEEP.R 2K system improves how players scan insects and gather information, whilst also allowing you to track materials and zoom in on discoveries from distance. It's a small quality of life improvement, but one that makes exploration feel smoother and a bit more rewarding. Another interesting addition is the coziness system. This mechanic encourages you to decorate your bases, to give positive, passive buffs. It essentially gives players another reason to invest time into their bases, and this in turn adds a bit more personality to areas that for me felt purely functional. On the gameplay side of things, there's also the introduction of the Ladybug Buggy, which ties into ongoing research into insect domestication. Mounted traversal has always been an interesting idea for this game, and this pushes that concept further by giving players a new way to move around the environment. There's also a new status effect called Tang, which relates to corrosion and acid exposure. It adds another environmental challenge to manage, particularly when exploring key parts of the new biome. And finally, the update introduces a range of new creatures, including black ants, fireflies, wasps, rust beetles, potato beetles, earwigs, and my favourite, the woolly aphids, along with something significantly larger lurking in the garden. Taken together, this update is clearly aiming to expand both the scale of the park and the variety of gameplay systems within it. The main story hook here for the update revolves around repairing the garden, which eventually gives you access to a recipe that allows you to unlock the archive door and attempt to save Burgle. Overall, I spent about 12 hours working through what the Toxic Tangle has to offer. On paper, that setup sounds like a solid progression loop, and while the journey to get there is actually pretty enjoyable, the ending of that particular thread does feel a bit abrupt. Once you reach that point, things just stop. There isn't much confirmation about what happens next or where the story goes from there, which makes the payoff feel slightly anticlimactic. That said, the journey itself is genuinely enjoyable. One thing that stood out for me in this update is how the quests are structured. Across both Grounded and Grounded 2, I never felt particularly connected to the quest system. Most of the time they exist to give context to the world rather than create memorable moments. But this update does something a little different. Repairing the garden turns the quest structure into something that feels more engaging. It does involve a lot of checklist style objectives, but those objectives naturally encourage exploration across different parts of the garden. Instead of simply ticking boxes, you end up moving through the environment in a way that feels purposeful. It's still not a narrative-driven experience, offering player agency, but does a better job of tying gameplay progression to exploration. Another system that's seen some improvements is mutations. Previously, switching between different loadouts depending on your weapon or build could feel a bit clunky. With a growing variety of weapons and playstyles in Grounded 2, constantly flicking between setups was becoming increasingly tedious. The changes introduced here help smooth that out by incorporating passive mutations and active perks. This makes the system flow much more naturally and reduces the amount of micromanagement required between fights. It's a relatively small change in terms of design, but it has noticeable impact on how the game feels during longer play sessions. Overall, the gameplay improvements here feel like a step in the right direction. Visually, the new garden area is excellent. One of the standout locations is the greenhouse, which looks incredible when you're exploring it from a tiny perspective. The scale, lighting, and environmental detail all combine to create a familiar sense of wonder. the series does so well. Moments like that are where Grounded really shine. However, one small concern still lingers. While the environment is beautifully designed, it's still ultimately more the same style of biome that the players have already experienced. The park continues to expand, but it hasn't yet introduced something that feels completely different from what came before. At this point, I'd really like to see the developers experiment with a dramatically different biome, something that changes the atmosphere or gameplay in a more significant way. That doesn't take away from the quality of the area itself, but it does highlight that the series may eventually need to push beyond the familiar to keep things fresh. The new creatures introduced in this update are a welcome addition. While some of them feel like natural extensions of insects we've already encountered, they still add variety to the ecosystem and help make the world feel more alive. Encounters with things like rust beetles or earwigs introduce slightly different behaviours and challenges, which keeps exploration feel interesting as you move through new zones. Even when the creatures themselves feel somewhat familiar, simply expanding the wildlife pool helps maintain the feeling that the park is constantly evolving. And in a survival game like this, that variety goes a long way. Without giving too much away, the update introduces a boss encounter that adds a strong moment of challenge. Boss fights in Grounded tend to work best when they lean into scale and chaos of fighting something much larger than you. This one follows the same philosophy, creating a fight that feels tense and rewarding once you figure out the mechanics. It's another highlight that helps the update feel substantial. The Ladybug Buggy is one of the more interesting additions in the update, with a higher health pool than other buggies. The Ladybuggy also includes a mounted water gun to help clear areas of tang from the garden. As a concept, the buggy system is a fun addition. Being able to move around the park with mounted insects changes the pacing of exploration quite a bit. It makes travelling across the map faster and gives players a new way to engage with the environment. My favourite is still the Orb Weaver, but I'm looking forward to seeing what comes next. The update also introduces new crafting options that give player access to higher tier equipment and progression paths. These additions help reinforce the sense that the park is growing over time, giving players more tools and resources to experiment and survive with as they explore new areas. For long-term players especially, new crafting opportunities are always welcome to keep things feeling fresh. Like most large updates, this one does come with a few new bugs. I would give Grounded 2 its flowers here. Stability in general is much better compared to its initial release. A lot of my complaints have now been fixed. However, the most noticeable issue I encountered was being stuck in third-person view, which clearly wasn't intended behaviour and was a bit disruptive. But a quick reset did fix it, but it did interrupt the flow. There was also some smaller technical quirks. For example, trying to sort your inventory while inside crafting benches or the buggies, so you have to manually close the menu and reopen your inventory to sort. I also noticed an issue during the night cycle where lighting would flicker between pitch black and slightly lighter darkness, which can be distracting when exploring at night. Another thing that stood out was how enemy spawning behaves when you're travelling quickly on a buggy. Because you're moving so fast, creatures sometimes spawn directly in front of you as the world loads them in. And then there's the one bug that honestly ended up being more entertaining than frustrating, watching the potato beetles get completely launched into the sky after a physics interaction. It clearly wasn't intentional, but it was funny to watch. And lastly, there's the long-standing Orb Weaver super jump, which still hasn't been fully resolved. Strangely though, that bug is actually fun at this point, making traversal much easier. Overall, the Toxic Tangle is genuinely a strong update for Grounded 2. Compared to the Hairy Scary update, this one feels far more substantial. It expands the park in a meaningful way, introduces new gameplay systems whilst refining older ones, and adds enough content to make returning to the game feel worthwhile. The garden itself looks fantastic. The mutation changes improve the flow of combat builds, and the quest structure does a better job of guiding exploration. That said, I still find myself hoping the game eventually pushes into something more dramatically different in terms of biome design. I can see the direction the developers are taking the park, and it's definitely starting to come together. I'd love to see this game take a bigger leap in terms of environmental variety. Even so, if you stepped away from Grounded 2 previously, this update is a good reason to jump back in. Brookhollow Park is growing, the systems are evolving, and it finally feels like the vision behind the game is starting to take shape. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this update breakdown, give the video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. Catch you in the next one.